To say that I've had a rocky experience with TDU Solar Crown really puts it lightly, and I feel like for many people, you probably feel like you had a similar experience. The now infamous Early Access 5th release, which is basically one of the few times recently that I've played a game where I couldn't actually play the game, is a time when many people probably just gave up on it and haven't come back. For me, it's more difficult than that, not only because I love the franchise, but because I have 4 different experiences of playing the game, and that was only the 3rd one, because before that I played the closed beta, as I'm sure some of you did as well, and very, very few of us, in comparison to that, played an early access copy, which was later than the beta, but before the 5th. That was basically like an early access code with full access to the game for channels to review it specifically. So basically it was the full game, but early access before the 5th. I think it was like on the 2nd or something like that. In closed beta form, I would give the game straight up a 7 out of 10. It was really good. The only reason why it wasn't higher is because I had to base it on what I experienced in the closed beta, which was only about 20% maybe of the map. I unlocked all of the roads, did all of the events. The game had no lag issues at all for me. Of course, no server issues because there was barely anyone playing it in comparison to later on, and I really enjoyed it. It wasn't necessarily perfect, which is why I gave it a 7, but it was very, very promising. Then things got even better in that early access form, and that's the form which I wish all of you could have experienced, because that is the one where things were both at their peak but also started to go downhill. Now, I will freely admit that the reason why they went downhill a bit is purely a personal thing, and that is because it was the full game that I had access to around, as I said, the 2nd, I thought, you know what, I'm going to blast through the game, unlock every road on the map, and just get loads of tips and tricks for people from day one so that they can dive into the game with an advantage. So from that perspective, I loved it. It was everything I already liked about the beta, but it was improved. Vehicles had become cheaper in that early access form, and the map was now fully open, so I could do the races, I could progress through the game, I could do off-road events, on-road events, and I got up to 95% road unlocks, and again this is before the 5th, so I was fully ready to dive into that experience, just polishing off the map and having fun with everyone else. And at that point it would have been an honest 8 out of 10 from me. It was a really fun experience. No server issues, no lag, barely any if any glitches that I remember having. In fact, I like to record glitches in this game, and you'll probably see some footage of funny moments or stuttering. All of those are post-release, and that says a lot. If everyone had access to that version of the game, you would all love it, probably as much as I do. But that's when the problems for my experience personally started. I can't speak for other reviewers, but they sent out an email, again this is before the 5th, telling us who were involved in the review stage of playing the game, that they were going to have to basically reset everyone's save to make sure that there were going to be no issues before the game was released. And it was phrased in such a way that made it seem like kind of a last minute thing. The reality is, only a few hours later, I received a more official email saying that they were doing it in fact to make the playing field more fair and level, if you will, so that everyone had to start the game again. So in other words, the earlier email was at best a misdirection and a misinterpretation, or at worst, a straight up lie. Because if they were already planning to reset everyone's saves, why give me the spiel about doing it for some other performance related reason, when the later email said nothing about that and had nothing to do with performance issues whatsoever? It was all about fairness. Now, I'm not fundamentally saying that I have an issue with making it fair for everyone, that makes sense. It was extremely annoying for me to have to go through the entire map again, but I get the reason behind it. What I take issue with is the lack of transparency there. That wasn't a good sign. Then of course the 5th came along, and this is when many of you joined the journey, because those who pre-ordered the game, as I did myself as well, depending on your type of pre-order, I think it was, you had the game in kind of a multi-stage rollout. I think it was like the 5th, and then what was it, the 8th or the 12th or something like that. Everyone knows about the 5th. It was a truly abysmal release of a game. A few people I think got in, I think maybe on the PC version it seemed, but on console it was literally unplayable. I was hoping to dive back into the game. I literally released like 5 or 6 videos in that first day alone that I'd thankfully pre-recorded. Beyond that, barely any of us could play it. So I feel like by default my score for that stage has to be a 0 out of 10, because it's not a bad game, it's unplayable. So you can't really say if it's bad or not. you may as well not own the game at all. A 0 out of 10 I think is a pretty fair score on that side of things. What about since then though? Well, to be honest, this is where things really get sad, because even then I was ready to give the game more leeway. I was looking forward to getting back on form, diving back in. They were working around the clock to fix the server issues, which I personally really appreciate. Of course they didn't intend for that to happen, of course they were trying to fix it, and doubtless plenty of people on the dev team hated some of the decisions that they were doubtless forced to make, and were now suffering consequences which they'd probably warned people about for months, if not years, in terms of server issues. Various other bugs that I'm sure some of them saw, raised issues about, and just never had anything done, didn't have the time, whatever the case may be. Of course that's speculation, it wouldn't surprise me at all, let's say, if that was the case. The problem is though that since playing it, since they kind of cleaned up the servers a bit, and incidentally I've still had issues since then, I'll still get kicked out of lobbies, I'll still have the game just randomly sign out, I'll still have bugs, glitches, choppy frame rate, as many people are. Not as much, but it's still there. And again, I'll remind you that before the 5th, there was literally none of that. And again, I'll remind us all that that is pre-server overload. So clearly the server has always been the weak link in this chain, and unfortunately that's one of the biggest downsides of the whole experience, and that is that because this game is so geared toward the online-only aspect, well, it's just fundamentally a massive Achilles heel. It's as if Achilles himself were just nothing but a heel. Like, the entire game is so based around this core idea of being online all the time, and I didn't really want to base my review and my thoughts around this same thing that everyone knows is the problem already, but it really is such a massively glaring problem that you cannot in good faith talk about any kind of review for the game without addressing its single biggest problem, which unfortunately is such a core of the game that you kind of can't fix it. And this is why my score, all included, at this point, with each stage kind of evened out, averaged out from the best to the worst, well, I'm going to give it a 5 out of 10, and that's about the best I can do. I think for some people that's probably too generous. For other people, maybe you're enjoying it a lot more and you had minimal issues. Both of those extremes are totally understandable. If you enjoy it, great. If you don't, I know why. But the reason why I'm giving it a 5 is because to me that perfectly represents this game. It's right down the middle. There's nothing so bad that you would never want to play it again, but there's nothing so good that will necessarily want to bring you back. It's a very weird place to be. There's so much potential in this game, and I like it a lot more than TDU 2, at least in concept. In those earlier access forms, I would say without question this was second only to the first game for me, and definitely better than TDU 2, which I never liked as much as many people seem to. I liked it well enough because it's what I had to work with, but I never loved TDU 2, and to this day I don't. On the other hand though, I think the problem is because this game is, as I said, so focused in on the multiplayer experience, which, let's be honest, was always an add-on to TDU, it was never the core gameplay. In that original game, as far back as, the PSP, PS2 versions, well, there was barely any multiplayer connectivity. There was some, I guess, but I never used it, and I was perfectly happy with a completely solo experience. And although for many people, perhaps they don't enjoy that anymore, well, I think it kind of shows that people don't necessarily want the multiplayer experience all the time because of all of the problems it brings. When you have something like Gran Turismo, which is always online, but for the most part works well enough to justify it, well, for me, for example, I very rarely have any server issues with Gran Turismo 7, for example, so I don't even notice the fact that it's always online. Some people have their problems, but speaking to my own experience, it's fine. I couldn't care less. Down the line though, it can have huge implications for losing access to the game, not being able to play stuff anymore. Just look at The Crew, for example. And it doesn't even have to be an always online game to have those kind of issues. I literally cannot even get access to the motorcycles in TDU 2 anymore because it's not available, and it hasn't been available for years. So losing access to stuff which you have paid real money for is frankly unacceptable, but for some reason it's still allowed to happen. And I really do think that this needs to get to the court stage, because companies like Apple have been heavily penalised for deliberately building phones that break too quickly, and they've gotten a lot better since they were forced to get a lot better. However, game companies are not being forced to do the same thing yet. There are some things which governments or courts get involved with, especially in Europe, but these broad sweeping strokes of the games having these issues, it still hasn't really been dealt with. At the end of the day, you don't even own the game. You're just renting it at this point, which is utterly insane. And paying for something which is just going to disappear at the end of it, well, at that point, it's literally just like a Netflix service, but for a game, instead of movies and TV series. That's unacceptable, and yet it keeps happening, and it keeps happening because we keep buying it. Why do we keep buying it? Well, because we want to enjoy games. So this vicious cycle probably won't end anytime soon unless we get it to be legally implemented that it has to change. I want to adore the game, and as I alluded to earlier on, my earlier thoughts on it were very positive. Many people didn't like the look of the graphics, didn't like the look of the physics, and even for me, I've been talking about TDU Solar Crown for literally years in terms of news piece videos on the channel, and even though I wasn't as excited for it as TDU 2, for example, after how much I loved the first game, I was still definitely very eagerly awaiting it as an alternative to Forza Horizon or Gran Turismo Sport at the time. Of course I was looking forward to it as a huge TDU fan. As more time went on though, I didn't become lukewarm, I just kind of had measured expectations, and those expectations ended up being right down the middle of the road where I could be disappointed or pleasantly surprised. When I saw the earliest visuals and physics, I was a bit worried. It looked a bit arcadey, but not in the charming older TDU kind of way, more like a lazy almost kind of way, which again concerned me. When I actually play the game, I have to say the physics are fine. I don't mind the physics at all for the most part. The cars can get a bit overly slidey, where once the tail comes out it just carries on going regardless of any correction that you do, and that can be annoying, especially if it's in something like a four-wheel drive car, which just doesn't come off as realistic. But for the most part, it's definitely again better than TDU 2 was, and for the first game I feel like it's so old at this point you can't really honestly compare it. I would also really be curious to see how motorcycles handle now, because that was always one of the weak points in the first two games. It was great to have bikes, but they handled so weirdly in comparison to other games, and these days you can't get away with that anymore because even though Tourist Trophy isn't around, Ride certainly is, and that's a pretty damn good benchmark in terms of how bikes should feel. So you just wouldn't be able to get away with those older physics, which I think is why they've put it off for now. The problem is, by that point, who will even care? The idea of having the casino come around so much later on, having Ibiza coming back but so far down the line, months if not years away in some cases, well, it's all well and good to have a roadmap, and I cannot stress this enough, I really appreciate that they're communicating that, because that's something Polyphony sure as hell never does, and it's one of the biggest issues we have with Gran Turismo. But Forza and TDU trying to put the effort into telling people what's to come, I love that. I really do appreciate it, which is why I go back to this point that clearly they were not trying to make a bad game. This does not come off as a cash grab, even though I could see why some people might feel that way, but they're mostly speaking in anger. They're not actually basing that on anything factual, they're just really frustrated, and I get that. Clearly though, the developers didn't want to make a bad game. You don't make TDU if you want to make a bad game. You could very easily make a bad game on a much lower budget than this, with a much smaller scope. The map itself is one of the best aspects of the game. It shows so much love. It's huge, it's creative, it's fun. It's an interesting choice of location, but I like it. And again, I like it a hell of a lot more than Ibiza. Hawaii will never be topped for me in this series, but I really like Hong Kong as an idea. I would have never thought of it as an option, but turns out it's pretty damn nice in terms of all of the different locations. Other stuff which I enjoyed were the feeling of being home again, which of course is extremely personal and will not be the same for two people, but just being in the world of TDU again after so long was such a nice experience, much in the same way as recently when I talked about Tokyo Extreme Racer coming back. I don't have that feeling or that experience with that game, but many people do, and that's really cool. And of course, from a marketing perspective, tapping into that kind of nostalgia is always going to be a good thing, as long as you do it right, and of course that's the caveat. Another thing which I really liked about the early access versions of the game in particular, and this is where playing it since the full release has kind of gone downhill for me, is the freedom to earn, the freedom to explore, and the freedom, although kind of deceptive in some senses, the seeming freedom to make your own path through the game. When I put out my tips video, much of which still works for the game if you do want to play it, with some car prices being different, etc., the idea of just exploring the map first is something which I still fully stand by. Because for me, for example, I'm back up to, well, now I'm on 99% roads, and I've got a feeling it's some of those unmarked dotted line dirt roads that I'm missing in the off-road section, but we'll have to see. But with 99% roads, I earned like 4.5+ million credits, tons of credits found, didn't even need to do a single race by that point. Of course I had the pre-order version, so I had extra vehicles anyway, but even without those, it really does give you the feeling that you can chart your own course through the game. If you can get $4-5 million credits, whatever, without even touching a single event, well, that's great. That's really promising, because that reminds me of the days of stuff like Gran Turismo 4, where you could play through the game in so many different routes. You could go through the licenses and win a ton of vehicles. You could do it the traditional way of, going into the used dealer and buying an old Evo or something. There were so many different ways of playing through the game, and you would ultimately end up finishing everything just in a different order. It's, to me, why I probably enjoy those games, because they remind me of stuff like Fallout, where you can play through Fallout in so many different ways, because it genuinely feels like an open world experience, but somehow in a car game. This has that potential. The problem is, especially if you do the map exploration first, which I have every single time I've had to start over from scratch, like 3 or 4 times now, when you do finally get back to doing the races, and it doesn't really matter when you do this, but it's much more glaring of a problem if you do it in the way that I did, which is the map first and then dive back in, you really do notice just how repetitive the racing is. And I understand that being repetitive is an inherent problem with racing games, be it circuit racing or road racing. It really does take a lot of effort from a team to keep the races fresh and interesting, and honestly, I really do believe that one of the biggest problems that we have these days in racing games is, not to keep harping on about Gran Turismo 4, it's not the only game to do it, but it's a prime example. This idea of having manufacturer-specific events, and quite a few of them, it means that you end up using most, if not all, of the vehicles and experiencing the full range of what the game has to offer, rather than just picking the car that you know is always going to win and just grinding the hell out of it, because that really does get boring and tedious, and it becomes just a cash-earning game for the sake of buying a couple of really expensive cars that you'll never need to add to. You get a Nissan GTR, an Audi TT, and a Bugatti Chiron, you've got 99% of the game done at this point, and that is just boring. It's just not interesting, and TDU did not used to feel that way. There were so many cars, many of them you didn't need and didn't have to use, but you wanted to, because the game just felt different. It had a different approach. There were things in the game which did not require just racing. You could deliver cars, you could give people a lift, you could do all these weird things which are not in the game anymore. Now maybe they'll be brought back, but we can't talk to that because it hasn't happened yet. We've got to judge the game on what it is now, which is why my review is coming out now. Down the line, we might have bikes, we might have Ibiza, we might have the casino, we might even get Hawaii back. Maybe the bikes will be fantastic, and I hope that I'm still interested enough in the game at that point to try it out at least. But honestly, I haven't touched the game in days, and I have no particular desire to go back to doing it. In fact, instead of playing this, I've been playing through Ride 2 from years ago, and I'm only doing that really to get all the bikes to do members section footage here on the channel. If that interests me more from years ago than this brand new game, that's not a great sign. Another thing I wanted to talk about, albeit fairly briefly, is the graphics. A lot of people seem to really have a problem with the graphics. I think those people might need to go back and look at TDU 2, because maybe you never played it, but go back and look at that game. It looks horrific, and it's one of the reasons why I never liked it at the time, especially after the first one. TDU 1, say the PC version or the Xbox, even without the Platinum mod, it looks phenomenal for its time. In particular, the thing which I always loved was how crisp and vibrant the sun reflections on the cars looked, and how beautifully tangible the asphalt on the road looks. It looks so good. You could literally trace cracks in the road. It was such an impressive looking game for its time, with such a massive map. To this day, my Xbox 360 struggles playing that game, and sounds like it's going to take off because it was such a requirement on the console. TDU 2 just felt like a massive step back to me, where it was all these overly vibrant colours, very cartoonish, very garish kind of look to it, and even though it has plenty of fans, and I do enjoy the game well enough, it just didn't have the same kind of feel. This one is definitely more down the second game route, but I definitely prefer the graphics of this one over the second one. That's for damn sure. The colours are still vibrant and poppy, it's a good looking location, but for example, I think the wet roads and the rain looks really nice. The nighttime driving looks good. The cars look good enough for what I'm expecting from this experience. I feel like some people just have wildly inconsistent expectations of what they think every racing game is going to look like. I never expected or honestly wanted this game to look like Gran Turismo 7. I was never expecting it to be, and if you were only deluding yourself, because TDU is never trying to be that. But what it is a game which looks as good as it needs to. To me, that was always the benchmark of TDU. Some of the shapes of the cars, some of the scaling was wildly off, but it didn't fundamentally matter because that wasn't what was was the most fun aspect of the game. The graphics were good enough. To me, it's like the road trip adventure kind of vibe. That is far from being the most interesting game graphically speaking, but it's more than good enough for what the game is trying to achieve. So to me, that's not really a valid enough criticism. What is a valid criticism is stuff like the choppy frame rate, bad kind of lag that comes along with the server, but the problem is that's not really to do with the graphics. That's all that online only, or at the very least mostly because of the online aspect of the game, that core, that nervous system, if you will, running through the entire body that is TDU Solar Crown. And as I alluded to earlier on, the problem is you can't in good faith rip all of that out of the game without breaking the entire game. There's nothing to do without it. Even the races themselves, one of the biggest issues I raised about the game even early on is that you cannot pause it. That is insane. The fact that in 2024 there's a racing game that you cannot even pause in any event, or at least in any kind of traditional racing event with more than one car, that's ridiculous. And even if you were going to have a game that is multiplayer first, well, so is Gran Turismo, so is Forza Horizon, and they easily implemented a version of just pausing the game in a solo mode. There is no good reason for TDU Solar Crown not to have a solo mode. That is unacceptable to me, and it really highlights that ongoing issue of the game just being very misguided in terms of what they think people wanted versus some of the core gameplay that we needed rather than wanted. You have to have a good solo experience, otherwise what's the point? It also of course speaks again to the problem of the longevity of the game. Will it end up being just gone from the storefront? We've already seen on day one you can't even play the game. Then what does that mean down the line when they just shut down the server? If they're not making enough money, if they move on to something else, whatever the case may be, is it just going to disappear? It doesn't exactly seem like they're well organized enough to plan a post-shutdown patch as some games have had in the past. So what, we're just going to lose the game forever and never be able to play it again? I can still play TDU 1 and 2, and I can still access my DLC for the most part, even in the first game, to this day on my Xbox 360. That's insanity compared to these days. Another huge issue with the game, because of it being so multiplayer involved, is that not only is the race structure unpausable, completely focused around having more than just you in the lobby in terms of real people, but the problem with that as well is it means that the AI feels like such a colossal afterthought. And this for some reason didn't bother me as much in the pre-access versions of the game. They definitely felt different, and for some reason this didn't come off as feeling like that to me in the earlier access version. You could always say, well, it was fresh and new and you were giving it the benefit of the doubt, and I'm sure there's some of that there, but honestly, as somebody who has played this game in 4 distinctly different forms now, it was not the same. The AI was not the same, the cars did not handle the same, prices were different, point levels were different, vehicles were definitely different, and the racing felt different. The fact that you can't even change the AI difficulty is not a great sign, because it clearly shows that they don't really care. They've just set it and forget it, and the problem with set it and forget it is it always leads to the same damn thing, and it's what this game suffers from, which is rubber banding, because boy does this game have a hell of a lot of rubber banding, and it's always the most annoying type where you'll be miles, sometimes literally, ahead of anything else, so much so that if you swivel the map around, you can't even see them. Whereas now you hit one lamppost and you've got 17 cars up your backside out of nowhere, as well as having horrendous traffic, something which I praised the game for when I first started playing it, and they've retroactively made it worse, significantly worse after release. I don't know if they were trying to get good reviews out there. That could be the kind of sleazy thing that they were instructed to do. I could also see it where they had pared down traffic to improve the server performance, but again, what was the point of having these closed betas if you weren't really testing anything? If you had all of this ample opportunity, multiple betas, multiple early accesses, even literal early access from the pre-order versions, you've had so many opportunities to test server limits, test server load, have more and more traffic, more and more people, and the fifth shows that they did nothing with that information, or at the very least did not enough with the information, because the traffic is ridiculous. It pops in and out all over the place. The traffic is just as dumb as ever, if not worse in some cases, and that was one of the things which I praised earlier on, because it was great. The traffic was minimal. I honestly didn't care that there wasn't any police in this game. I still don't. I think that's a great improvement, because the police were always dumb in TDU 1 and 2 anyway, and always came off as just an annoyance, a way of draining your bank account. In the third game, the traffic has become bad again. It's like they took all of this positive stuff and thought, yeah, we won't do that then. That's great. Let's tick that good thing off the list and just really harvest it down to being trash. It really does feel like if you tried to go out of your way to make it the worst possible experience, you couldn't really have done any better than they did, which is such a shame because, again, I don't think they wanted to do that. I think there's too much evidence of love in the game, misguided as some of it may be. There is too much evidence that they were trying to make a game that they loved, which I'm sure many of them do still love and want to succeed, but it's almost like the game feels like it's set up its own booby traps for itself and keeps tripping up over them. It almost reminds me of like a Looney Tunes loop that the game devs are stuck in, where they'll step in a bear trap, go yow, get their foot out, walk around in a circle, scratch their head and step on it again and go yow, and then get their foot out, walk around and just repeat over and over again. It's ridiculous and it's so sad to watch because it does have so much potential, which to say has been squandered is like the understatement of the century, I feel like, when it comes to racing games. In good faith, I cannot recommend that you should be playing this game, and that is such a change of tone for any who watched my earlier footage. You can still watch it, it's on the channel, and I stand by the things that I said before because at the time, all of those things were true. I did a video about the issues which I thought the game had, some of which it still has, some of which have gotten worse, and I also made more positive videos, which I also still stand by because you can use those videos that I made to really see just how quickly the timeline devolved into slop of what this game became. And it's such a shame because I want to love it. I want to dive back in, but every time I've tried to do so, I end up trying to grind these events again. I despise, quite literally, I despise every AI event in this game. It is such repetitive, boring, cheating, rubber banding slop that I literally, without any word of exaggeration, spent all of my time clearing through all of the time trials and all of the solo experiences before I inevitably had to go back to AI events. And when I had to go back to AI, I made sure to do the off-road stuff first, most of which I've now done, because at least off-road the game isn't quite as savvy. You can bash it off around corners to get rid of it, etc. And as long as you've got the buggy, you're pretty much always going to win. Even then, it went downhill. I used to love the off-roading, and now I hate it, because you'll have stuff like the buggy's wheels catching together, you'll have cars which are just inexplicably quicker than they used to be. It's dumb. It's just dumb. And it's such a shame because I want nothing more than to tell you, yes, TDU is back. This is one of my most beloved, to this day, one of my most formative, especially in my youth, franchises that I've ever played. And to say that this inspired so much here on the channel is a colossal understatement. For those of you who don't know, Unsung Heroes, an entire series on this channel, which for some of you is your favourite thing I've ever done, is mostly because of stuff like TDU having these obscure cars. As a child, it was when I played games like this that made me love the oddball, the different, the unique. It spawned that indirectly. More so than that, TDU 2, as some of you know, made me choose my first car because of that game in real life. The Touareg 5-litre V10 is directly because of Test Drive Unlimited 2. This series has been massively formative in my life, and to have to say stuff like this is so sad. And the saddest part is, I'm not even sad. I just don't really care anymore. The game just saps any kind of hope out of you, because you think, well, what's the point in hoping for this to get better? Because to make the game truly better, you would have to revamp the entire core experience from the ground up. Any version of this game that ever comes along, unless it has a radically different approach to the solo experience and completely restructures the entire thing into essentially an offline mode, well, they're not going to do that. And unless they do, many of these problems just aren't going to go away, which is such a shame because it's a game where I want to do content, I want to talk about it, I want to be positive, and yet I haven't played it in days and I don't miss it. And that is tragic, especially for such an iconic franchise as Test Drive Unlimited, of all things. The OG when it comes to stuff like this, up there with Gran Turismo, Forza, Project Gotham and others too, in terms of literally being a pioneer of its craft. Long before Forza Horizon ever became what it has, TDU was already doing it, and for its time, doing it a hell of a lot better. What a shame.